Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Before we get into things tonight, I want you to just take a second to settle in. Dim the lights if you haven't already, find a comfortable spot, maybe grab a blanket, and just let the weight of the day kind of slide off your shoulders. Tonight, we're going to talk about a very long, very expensive, and very sandy mistake. Or a triumph, depending on who you ask and how much money they lost in the process. We're looking at the digging of the Suez Canal. It's a story of ego, thousands of miles of desert, and a French diplomat who basically decided that geography was merely a suggestion. So just close your eyes or keep them heavy, and let's float back to the 19th century, where the clothes were uncomfortable and the colonial ambitions were, frankly, exhausting. To understand the Suez Canal, we have to understand the sheer, stubborn persistence of Ferdinand de Lesseps. Now, Ferdinand wasn't an engineer. Of course he wasn't. That would have been too practical. He was a diplomat, which in the 1850s essentially meant he was very good at talking people into things that were probably against their best interests. He had this vision of cutting a hole through the Isthmus of Suez to link the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. It sounds simple enough when you say it fast, but the area was basically a giant, blistering sandbox owned by the Ottoman Empire and governed by the Khedives of Egypt, who were at the time trying very hard to look modern while dealing with a bank account that was rapidly heading towards zero. Ferdinand had spent some time in Egypt as a young man, and he'd become buddies with the viceroy's son, Said Pasha. And when I say buddies, I mean Ferdinand once helped Said lose weight by teaching him how to ride a horse and giving him some diet tips. Because why not build a multi-million-dollar international shipping lane based on the fact that you helped a guy fit into his trousers? When Said eventually became the Khedive in 1854, Ferdinand basically teleported back to Egypt. He didn't even wait for a formal invitation. He just showed up, reminded Said of their old friendship, and within a few weeks, he had a concession to build the canal. It was a classic, it's not what you know, it's who you gave salad to 20 years ago situation. The British, predictably, hated this. They hated it so much. Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, thought the whole thing was a French trick to mess with British trade to India. He called it a bubble and a swindle. And honestly, looking at the early blueprints, he wasn't entirely wrong. The plan involved digging through 100 miles of salt flats and desert without any clear idea of how to provide water for the tens of thousands of workers needed. But Ferdinand didn't care about logistics. He was a big picture guy, which is usually code for someone else will figure out the math later. So Ferdinand starts the Universal Suez Ship Canal Company. He tries to sell shares to the British, who tell him to get lost. He tries to sell shares to the Austrians and Russians, who are equally unimpressed. Eventually, he just turns to the French public. He frames it as a matter of national pride, a way to stick it to the British, and the French middle class, bless them, absolutely ate it up. They bought shares with their life savings, convinced they were investing in the future of civilization, or at least a very lucrative shortcut. Construction began in 1859 near what would become Port Said. And when I say construction began, I mean a few hundred people showed up with shovels. It was a bit pathetic, really. They were standing in a wasteland, miles from any fresh water, trying to dig a trench in the sand that the wind would immediately fill back in. It was like trying to dig a hole at the beach while the tide is coming in, except the tide is made of heat exhaustion and bureaucracy. The labor situation was, to put it mildly, a nightmare. Said Pasha had promised to provide Egyptian laborers through the corvée system, which is just a fancy historical way of saying forced labor. Tens of thousands of Egyptian peasants were dragged away from their farms to dig in the mud with their bare hands. They were supposed to be paid and fed, but the logistics were so botched that many ended up drinking brackish water and eating whatever they could find. It wasn't exactly the glorious march of progress Ferdinand had described in his glossy brochures. It was mostly just a lot of very tired men standing in a ditch. Then there was the water problem. You can't have thousands of people working in the desert if they don't have anything to drink. It's one of those pesky biological requirements Ferdinand seemingly forgot about. For the first few years, they had to haul fresh water across the desert on the backs of thousands of camels. Imagine the cost. Just a constant, slow-moving caravan of camels bringing water to people who were digging a hole to bring in more water. It was an endless, sandy loop of inefficiency. Eventually, they realized they had to dig a separate sweet-water canal from the Nile just to keep the workers alive long enough to finish the main canal. While the workers were suffering, the elites were doing what they do best, bickering. The British were still trying to sabotage the project at every turn. They pressured the Ottoman Sultan to withhold official approval. They sent spies to report on the horrific working conditions, not because they cared about the workers, but because it was a good way to make the French look bad. It was a massive, slow-motion chess game where the pawns were literally dying of cholera in the Egyptian sun. By 1863, Said Pasha died. He was replaced by his nephew, Ismail Pasha. Now, Ismail was a man who loved three things: Paris, spending money, and the idea of being a world power. He looked at the canal and saw a way to make Egypt the center of the world, but he also realized that the forced labor system was making Egypt look like a medieval backwater to the rest of Europe. So, under international pressure, he abolished the corvée. This was great for the peasants, but it was a disaster for the canal's budget. Ferdinand de Lesseps now had to actually pay people and buy expensive steam-powered machinery to replace the manual labor. This is where the project gets really weird and mechanical. Since they couldn't use thousands of people with shovels anymore, they brought in these massive, clanking, steam-driven dredges. These things were the monsters of the 19th century. They were loud, they belched black smoke, and they moved at the speed of a tired snail. But they worked. Slowly, the ditch started to look like a canal. The desert was being sliced open by iron and steam. The cost, however, was spiraling out of control. Ismail Pasha was borrowing money from European banks at interest rates that would make a loan shark blush. He was basically mortgaging the entire country of Egypt to finish a canal that he wouldn't even fully own. It was a masterclass in financial self-destruction. But every time a gala was held or a new section was completed, Ismail would throw a party that lasted for days. He was a man who believed that if you look successful, the debt doesn't actually exist. It's a bold strategy, but as we'll see, it usually ends with the British taking over your house. As the 1860s wore on, the canal became an obsession for the French. Empress Eugenie, the wife of Napoleon III, became its royal patroness. She saw it as a monument to French genius. Ferdinand, ever the flatterer, made sure she felt like the star of the show. He was constantly sending her updates, likely glossing over the parts where the machinery broke down or another 1,000 workers got sick. To the salons of Paris, the Suez Canal wasn't a dusty, grueling construction site. It was an exotic, romantic bridge between East and West. The reality on the ground was a bit different. The heat was so intense that the metal on the dredges would become hot enough to burn skin. The wind blew constant sandstorms that blinded the operators and filled the work sites. And then there was the salt. The bitter lakes which the canal had to pass through were exactly what they sounded like: vast, dried-up salt basins. When the water was finally let in, it created a surreal, shimmering landscape that looked beautiful but was essentially a wasteland. Let's pause for a moment and just think about the scale of this. They were moving 75 million cubic meters of earth in the 1860s without computers, without GPS, and with a workforce that was constantly rotating because people kept dying or quitting. It's a miracle of stubbornness. Ferdinand de Lesseps was like a man who decides to move a mountain with a teaspoon and somehow convinces half of Europe to buy teaspoons. By 1869, the canal was finally nearing completion, but the drama wasn't over. There was a massive rock formation at a place called Serapeum that the dredges couldn't break through. They had to use gunpowder to blast it apart, which was a terrifyingly imprecise science back then. Everyone was holding their breath, wondering if the whole thing would just collapse or if they'd accidentally trigger some kind of geological catastrophe. But with enough explosives and a lot of luck, the path was cleared. The grand opening was scheduled for November 1869, and Ismail Pasha decided this was the moment to show the world that Egypt had arrived. He spent a fortune, money he absolutely did not have, on the celebrations. He built a palace on the canal specifically for the guests. He commissioned Giuseppe Verdi to write an opera, Aida, for the occasion, though it wasn't actually finished in time, which is just peak Suez Canal energy. He invited every royal, diplomat, and journalist in Europe. Empress Eugenie arrived on the French imperial yacht Laïque. She was meant to be the first to transit the canal, but there was a tiny, hilarious problem. The night before the official opening, a British ship, the HMS Newport, quietly slipped ahead in the dark. The captain, George Nares, navigated the canal without lights and anchored right at the front of the line. When the sun came up, the French were horrified to see a British flag at the head of the procession. The British captain was later given a formal reprimand for his recklessness, but he also secretly received a thank you from the British Admiralty, because if you're going to be a global superpower, you might as well be a petty one too. The opening ceremony was a fever dream of 19th century excess. There were fireworks, feasts, and religious ceremonies where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish leaders all blessed the canal. It was a brief, shining moment of international cooperation before everyone went back to trying to colonize each other. Ismail Pasha was beaming, Ferdinand de Lesseps was a hero, and the French public felt like they had conquered the world. But as the fireworks faded and the guests went home, Part 2. The British Heist and the Khedive's Empty Pockets. So we left off with a giant party and a very large bill. It's the morning after the grand opening of 1869, and the metaphorical hangover is starting to set in for Ismail Pasha. While the world was marveling at the fact that you could now sail from London to Bombay without having to go all the way around Africa, which, let's be honest, was a massive win for anyone prone to seasickness, the Egyptian treasury was looking a bit like a ghost town. Ismail had spent roughly £1.5 million on the opening ceremonies alone. To put that in perspective, that's about $200 million today, just for some fireworks, a temporary palace, and a lot of very expensive champagne for European royals who mostly spent their time whispering about how tacky the whole thing was. Ismail was obsessed with being seen as a civilized European-style monarch. He once famously said, "My country is no longer in Africa. We are now part of Europe," which is a bold geographical claim, but unfortunately, European banks didn't quite see it that way. They saw Egypt as a giant gold-plated ATM that had a broken out-of-order sign hanging off it. By 1875, the situation had gone from concerning to total catastrophe. Egypt was essentially bankrupt. The interest payments on the foreign loans were consuming more than half of the country's entire annual revenue. Ismail was desperate. He started looking around his palace for anything he could sell: the furniture, the jewelry, the metaphorical family silver. And then he remembered he still owned 44% of the shares in the Suez Canal Company. Now, this is where the story gets into the realm of a Victorian spy thriller, but a very slow-moving one. Word got out that Ismail was looking to sell his shares to the French. When the news reached London, the British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, nearly fell out of his chair. Remember, the British had spent the last 2 decades calling the canal a ditch in the sand and a French hallucination. But now that it was actually working, they realized that if the French owned the whole thing, they could basically hold the British Empire hostage. Disraeli needed money, and he needed it fast. Parliament was in recess, so he couldn't ask them for the funds. So he did what any sensible prime minister would do. He went to his friend Lionel de Rothschild. According to the legend, Disraeli sent his secretary to Rothschild's house. Rothschild was eating grapes at the time. The secretary said, "The prime minister wants £4 million tomorrow." Rothschild reportedly spat out a grape seed and asked, "What is your security?" The secretary replied, "The British government." Rothschild just nodded and said, "Tell him he shall have it." And just like that, with a £4 million check from a private banker, the British government swooped in and bought the Egyptian shares before the French even knew what was happening. It was the ultimate "I told you so." The British now had a controlling interest in the very project they had tried to sabotage. Queen Victoria was delighted. Disraeli was a hero. And Ismail Pasha, well, he got a temporary infusion of cash, but he had just sold the most valuable asset his country would ever own. It was like selling your house to pay for a really nice dinner. Naturally, this didn't solve Ismail's problems. In fact, it made them worse. The Europeans and the French, concerned about their investments, basically moved into Egypt and started running the place. They set up something called the Caisse de la Dette Publique, the Commission of the Public Debt. It was exactly as fun as it sounds. 2 European officials, 1 British and 1 French, sat in the Egyptian cabinet and told the Khedive how he could and couldn't spend his money. Egypt had effectively become a bankrupt corporation under foreign receivership. Imagine being the Khedive. You've spent your life trying to modernize your country, building opera houses and grand boulevards in Cairo, and now you have 2 grumpy European accountants hovering over your shoulder telling you can't buy that new gold-plated carriage because you owe money to a bank in London. It was a massive blow to his ego. By 1879, the Europeans had had enough of Ismail's attempts to regain control. They pressured the Ottoman Sultan, who was technically still Ismail's boss, to fire him. One day, a telegram arrived at the palace addressed to Ismail Pasha, former Khedive of Egypt. That's a rough way to find out you're unemployed. He was replaced by his son, Tawfiq, who was much more, let's say, compliant. Basically, he was a puppet who knew better than to argue with the guys who held the checkbook. But while the elites were playing musical chairs with the throne, the people of Egypt were getting increasingly angry. They were being taxed into the ground to pay back loans that hadn't benefited them at all. The Egyptian army was being downsized, and the officers were being replaced by Europeans. This led to a nationalist uprising led by a colonel named Ahmed Rabi. His slogan was "Egypt for the Egyptians," which is a pretty reasonable sentiment, but it absolutely terrified the British. The British were worried that if Rabi took power, he might close the canal or stop paying the debt. So, in 1882, they did the most 19th century Britain thing possible. They sent the Royal Navy to bombard Alexandria. It was a brutal display of gunboat diplomacy. After a few days of shelling and some land battles, the British Army occupied Cairo. They told everyone they were just staying for a little while to restore order. They stayed for 72 years. So the canal that was supposed to be a monument to Egyptian progress had ended up becoming the reason for its colonization. It's one of those bitter ironies of history. The French built it, the Egyptians paid for it with their lives and their treasury, and the British ended up sitting on top of it with a garrison of soldiers, making sure the tea from India arrived on time. Life on the canal during the early British occupation was a weird bubble of colonial luxury. At the northern end, you had Port Said, which became one of the most debauched and cosmopolitan cities in the world. It was a place where you could find anything, and I mean anything, if you had the money. Sailors from every corner of the globe mixed with French engineers, British officers, and Egyptian laborers. It was a city built on salt, coal, and the transit of goods, and it smelled like a mixture of all three. The canal itself was a technical marvel, but a logistical nightmare. In the early days, ships could only pass through during the day. At night, it was too dark to navigate the narrow channel without running aground. This meant that ships had to anchor at either end or in the Great Bitter Lake, creating these massive floating traffic jams. The Suez Canal Company eventually solved this by mandating the use of electric searchlights on every ship, which must have looked incredibly eerie, these massive glowing orbs sliding through the pitch-black desert night. The pilots who navigated the ships were the aristocrats of the canal. They were mostly French, a legacy of Ferdinand de Lesseps, and they were paid absurd amounts of money to ensure that a massive cargo ship didn't get wedged sideways in the sand, an event that would, as we've seen in more recent history, basically break the world economy. They lived in beautiful villas in Ismailia, a town built halfway along the canal that was designed to look like a little slice of provincial France right in the middle of the desert. Meanwhile, back in Europe, Ferdinand de Lesseps was still riding high on his fame. He was the great Frenchman. He was so confident in his Suez success that he decided to try the same thing in Panama, because surely if you can dig a hole through a flat desert, you can dig one through a mountainous, yellow fever-infested jungle, right? Spoilers, he couldn't. The Panama Project was a horrific disaster that ruined his reputation and sent him into a spiral of dementia and disgrace. But for a while, he was the man who had reshaped the world. As the years went on, the canal became more than just a waterway. It became the jugular vein of empire. During World War I, the British were terrified that the Ottoman Turks would attack the canal and cut off the supply lines. They turned the whole area into a massive fortress. Thousands of soldiers from across the British Empire, Indians, Australians, New Zealanders, found themselves sitting in trenches in the Sinai, guarding a strip of water they had never heard of before. The Turks did eventually attack in 1915, bringing heavy artillery across the desert on the backs of camels. It was a daring move, but they were repelled. The canal remained open, but the psychological impact was huge. The British realized that the canal was a vulnerability as much as it was an asset. It was a prize that everyone wanted, and a prize you have to defend is a prize that eventually exhausts you. Through all this, the Egyptian people were still there, watching as their land was used as a playground for empires. The tension was simmering, waiting for the right moment to boil over. But for now, we're in the long, slow afternoon of the British Empire. The ships keep passing through, the coal smoke hangs over the water, and the profits keep flowing back to London and Paris, while the desert sand continues its patient, quiet attempt to fill the ditch back in. We'll talk about how the whole thing eventually exploded in the 1950s in the next part. But for now, just think about those ships moving through the desert at 3 miles per hour, the searchlights cutting through the dark, and the strange, quiet power of a man-made river. So, we've reached the 1950s. The world has changed quite a bit since Ferdinand de Lesseps was dieting with princes. 2 world wars have passed. Empires are starting to look a little frayed at the edges, and the British are still hanging on to the Suez Canal like a security blanket they've outgrown but refuse to wash. They still had about 80,000 troops stationed in the canal zone, which is a lot of soldiers just to make sure boats keep moving in a straight line. Enter Gamal Abdel Nasser. If you're looking for a historical figure who personifies tired of your nonsense, it's Nasser. He was a charismatic army officer who helped overthrow the Egyptian monarchy in 1952. King Farouk, the last king of Egypt, was sent packing on his royal yacht with 204 trunks of luggage, which is a lot of outfits for a guy going into exile. Nasser, meanwhile, wanted to build the Aswan High Dam to modernize Egypt and provide electricity. But dams are expensive, and the Americans and British, who had initially promised to fund it, suddenly pulled their support because Nasser was being a bit too friendly with the Soviet Union. Nasser's response was probably the greatest "watch me" in the history of geopolitics. On July 26, 1956, during a massive speech in Alexandria, he used a secret code word. Whenever he said the name de Lesseps, it was the signal for the Egyptian army to move in and seize the offices of the Suez Canal Company. He announced to a cheering crowd that the canal, built with Egyptian labor and paid for with Egyptian blood, was now officially Egyptian property. The British and French were, to put it mildly, absolutely livid. The British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, took it personally. He reportedly said he wanted Nasser destroyed. For the British, losing the canal wasn't just about trade. It was about the humiliation of being told no by a former colony. So they hatched a plan. And when I say plan, I mean a convoluted secret conspiracy that sounds like it was written by a frustrated novelist. They teamed up with the French and the Israelis for something called the Protocol of Sèvres. The idea was that Israel would attack Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula. Then, Britain and France would act like concerned neighbors and step in to separate the combatants and protect the canal. It was the international relations equivalent of punching someone and then offering to hold their coat while you take their wallet. In October 1956, the plan went into action. Israel invaded, and the British and French issued an ultimatum for both sides to withdraw. When Nasser obviously ignored them, the British and French started bombing Egyptian airfields and dropped paratroopers in Port Said. On paper, it was a military success. They took the canal, but they had completely miscalculated the room. The rest of the world looked at Britain and France and said, "What are you doing?" This was the era of decolonization, and the sight of old European empires bullying a smaller nation for a ditch in the sand didn't sit well. Even the United States under President Eisenhower was furious. They were worried this would drive the entire Middle East into the arms of the Soviets. Eisenhower didn't send troops. He did something much scarier. He threatened to crash the British economy by selling off U.S. holdings of the British pound. It was a financial execution. The British realized they couldn't afford to fight the Egyptians and the Americans at the same time. Humiliated, they were forced to withdraw. Anthony Eden's career was over, and the era of Britain as a global superpower essentially ended in the mud of Port Said. Nasser, on the other hand, became a hero of the Arab world. He had stood up to the old empires and won. But the canal itself had suffered. During the fighting, Nasser had sunk dozens of ships in the channel to block it. He basically said, "If I can't have it, nobody can." It took months to clear out the wrecks, ships full of cement, old tugboats, and scrap metal, all just sitting at the bottom of the desert river. The canal remained a flashpoint. In 1967, during the Six-Day War between Israel and Egypt, the canal was closed again. This time, it stayed closed for 8 years. There was a group of 15 cargo ships caught in the middle when the war broke out, trapped in the Great Bitter Lake. They became known as the Yellow Fleet because of the desert sand that covered them. The crew stayed on board for years, forming their own little floating country, complete with their own postage stamps and Lake Olympic Games. Imagine being a sailor on a 3-week voyage that turns into an 8-year stay in a salty lake. The canal didn't reopen until 1975, after another war and a lot of clearing of unexploded mines. Since then, it's been expanded and deepened, becoming the massive industrial artery we know today. It's no longer a romantic colonial outpost with palm trees and villas. It's a high-stakes toll road where massive container ships, stacked high with everything from iPhones to sneakers, glide through the sand. As you drift off, just think about the millions of tons of earth moved by hand, the fortunes lost in London banks, the secret meetings in French villas, and the stubbornness of a diplomat who just wanted to dig a hole. The Suez Canal is a monument to human ego, a thin blue line drawn through the dust that changed the world one slow, sandy mile at a time. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next chapter of our long, quiet history.